Hi folks, I want to show you a scene that I have just completed in Moho Pro that was fairly complex because it's got action in there, and it wasn't made any easier by the fact that I didn't do any storyboarding, all in my head, and I thought I had it figured all out, and it didn't work at all, and I had to just completely rethink the scene all without storyboard. I mean, as long as you do this as a one-man show, not storyboarding is still, I think, a viable option. It can result in more work, often results in less work, but as soon as you involve more than one person, I think storyboarding is a must. So as long for this pilot, since I'll be doing all the editing and animation work myself, I just said, no, I just don't have time for storyboarding. There's so much other stuff I have to do. Nah, not happening. So let me just go here. So I'm going to use this macOS function for presenting, shooting, continuity camera thingy because it saves me a lot of work, and I'm really lazy and I didn't want to do all of this in Final Cut. It's just I don't have the time, really. Okay, let's first take a look at the scene in Final Cut. So this is the whole episode. I've done this as like a radio play. So it's basically just all the audio is in there, all the narration is in there. The red spots here is the music, so it's a little bit of music in there. The green stuff is all sound effects. Maybe like this look a bit more the dialogue here, and then so the tiny dots are all the sound effects and the music. And what I want to show you is the second scene. Actually, the first scene is an establishing shot. This is this little part here. So you got the intro with music. I haven't really put in anything yet there. This should have probably key scenes from the pilot, or I'm going to make a few fake scenes from future episodes that don't really exist. You know, as you have your animation intro. And then at the end of the intro, you get the establishing shot here. This is the castle, the main location, but it's most likely to change. I have made so many renderings and versions of this background, different castles, different backgrounds. It'll change again. And then there is the scene, so it zooms in on the castle, and we're in the castle in the room here. Cuckoo clock at the back. And there's some talking going on. And as you can see, that was a real bitch, this tablecloth.
Serial as always. TV, deck thyself.
And then suddenly out of the bowl comes this tentacle, boom, and then there's a really crazy action scene and stuff going on. And anyway, I'm going to show you the whole scene at the very end again. This is basically done in 3 files in Moho. Let me first show you the anatomy of this whole thing. So for one thing, for this scene, I made the background in Moho itself, and didn't used to do that. I often pulled in PNG files. But for one thing is I found that having to create vector graphics in Affinity or Illustrator is a bit of a pain in the butt, and there's a lot of things you cannot do that Moho can do. Say for example, you have an outline. You have an outline of an object, and Illustrator it either has an outline or it doesn't have an outline. That's it. So in Moho you can make the outline visible and invisible between points. And that's another thing I really, really want to use for backgrounds a lot, that I couldn't do in Illustrator and would have to do workarounds, and it's a pain. Another good thing is if you do it in Moho, I can set an outline style, and I can then change the thickness of all outlines in the background as I need it, when I need it. So there's not only this kind of zoom size compensation. If you resize the background, it'll change outline width. You can also simply just arbitrarily change the width, which is great. The reason I didn't do backgrounds in Moho in the past is it used to, if there was a lot of vector stuff going on, it used to become very crashy, very unstable. Moho of now, version 14, is rock solid. I had maybe 1 or 2 crashes, but that was probably me just doing stupid stuff. And it's gotten much, much better, so it's much more reliable. It could also partially have to do that I switched from an Intel old Mac, which could barely play back anything in Moho, to my new M3 Max, which is just butter smooth. No matter how complex the scene, playback in the preview is super high res, butter smooth, absolutely fine. So it could just be that the GPU is just much more powerful and it just doesn't crash. This time around I actually didn't do any 3D stuff, as you can see here, so it's just all flat. Because I don't need any parallax, and I figure it's just much easier to just only deal with layers. I've put the whole scene in a folder, and as you can see, this icon here, this actually means that the animated layer order is enabled. That means I can then just keep on moving objects in front and behind each other as I need it during the animation, and that makes life much easier than having to resort to other weird things. This is the scene. The actual part that you will be seeing in the beginning is just this part, only a very small part of the whole room. And as you might have noticed, that this whole room is kind of f***ed up because right now there's really only a shadow for the table and not for the chairs, and so the chairs look like they're floating a bit. But since I'm not going to be showing this part of the room anyway, I just left it as is. Never mind. So basically these 4 chairs at the back, they're behind the table, and the ones at the front are in front, you'd think, but actually if you're really precise, you can see that part of this chair goes under the tablecloth, which is part of the table, and so it's a bit more complicated. So only the back of the chair is at the very front here, and the lower part is the legs are just here. Yeah, this is just layers and more layers, you know, endlessly. Next thing is the cuckoo clock, which I chose to just make it a rig because I thought, well, you might have it display different times. You might want to actually have the pendulum move, you know, or have these move, or I could stretch them out, make them longer, make those ways longer to show that the kind of not wind it up entirely, and make it display different times. I have no cuckoo coming out of the clock yet, and if you look at the scene, so I just switch on the characters here. They're right now all behind the table. In reality, her arm would have to be, of course, in front of her body, duh, but this arm too on the table should be in front of the table. Same for him, his hands and lower arms have to be in front of the table. So I made an instance of Frank and put it in front of the table, but not the whole character, duh. Only made the front hand, lower arm, and the back hand and the lower arm visible. If I hide this, you can see Humbug is not even in the frame right now. And so he's talking, and there's a lot of stuff going on here. So the clock, as you see, is an animation cycle, the pendulum. You can see those bubbles, and that is basically a particle generator, where I made one bubble and just had it bubble a little bit, just randomly. So I have those bubbles going on. This is the cauldron, and as you can see, it says cauldron and tentacle because this thing has a little surprise in it. There is a tentacle coming out, of course, which is later in the scene. Let me see, where is it? It's not even coming out in this scene. See, I was lying. I thought I'd do it all in one scene, in one file, and I figured out it's just too complicated and makes everything too messy, because once a certain scene is gone, there's several objects you don't need anymore in that scene, so you actually want to take them out just to make everything simpler, make it render quicker, and all these things. So here he holds these are actually hand shapes, so a hand with a paper and a hand with a letter that he has, and when he stands up,
They're gonna cut our elect.
and puts the paper on the table, basically he uses different hand shapes with flat hands that hold nothing, and right at that moment you switch on the visibility of the letter envelope on the table. Here it's invisible. It's already here, the envelope too. This is here just invisible, and it just switches. And it looks as if he's putting the stuff on the table in a second. And of course, yeah, when he stands up, as you can see, if you stand up, you like this, boom, he moves the chair. So I've also animated the chair. And that's just a pure layer animation, just very simple, just timed to move with that. And then he talks to Humbug. Humbug comes into the scene, walk cycle. These red circles, if you wonder, are actually armatures. If I select Frank, you can see this bone in the middle. This is basically for the eye. So this is like the eyeball, and there's a pupil in the eyeball that I control directly. Humbug comes into the scene. There's a walk cycle going on. You can see here. The original version I made was actually slower and I felt it was unnatural, so I sped it up a bit. You can easily speed up walk cycles if you select the whole walk cycle and you hold Option. I think on Windows it is Alt. And if you hold Option and you drag the end, as you can see, it actually kind of scales the whole area you had selected, so you can make the walk cycle much quicker. Just as an extreme example here,
Give me some breakfast, stat.
Would be much quicker. This is actually hilarious.
Give me some breakfast.
I love it.
Yes, yes.
You can also make it much slower if you want to. Option, you just drag it out, and it'd be like
breakfast, stat.
Like some slow motions. And now this scene, this has been a real pain to figure out how to do it. So he takes this tablecloth, this magical tablecloth, puts it on the table, and I tried different things. Like I first had a normal vector object and put a bitmap image in it. Didn't work. Then I tried a bitmap image and warping it looked like terrible. And then I figured, I didn't know that you can actually take a vector object and warp that. And I can show you how I set this up actually. There is the actual tablecloth, which is all vectors. Just to prove the point, let's make this thing bigger. With a magnet you can just deform everything. And I made the mesh so that it has points at the same areas where there are vector points. So when it deforms the whole object, that the vector points can deform with it, so it kind of follows those points. And I found that this number of points is actually enough to make it look mostly okay. And I start here with a compressed version of this. And then he goes, you can see this is just a vector shape that deforms the tablecloth here. It's not even frame by frame, as you can see. I only have these key positions where I actually did shape it, and the rest is just auto keyframing. That's the magic of Moho, that it's really good at. And it looks decent. I would like it to flap up a bit more, but then it gets complicated, because then if you go, you can't really do this. You'd have to go 3D. It would make everything more complicated. So I thought, like, yeah, let's just go fake. It's just a bit of a this one is a bit of a cheat, but it's fair enough. The other thing that is kind of complicated is, so Humbug is behind the table. The tablecloth is in front of him, except for his fingers, not even the hands, but the fingers only have to be in front of it. And then it switches here. No, it doesn't. His hands now have to be, so he's behind the table, right? Fingers are in front of the table, tablecloth is behind the table, tablecloth is in front of the table, and now hands and lower arms have to be in front of the table, and they have to be behind the table again. And there you go. So a lot of switching, and if you look at it, what happens here, you can see it on the right side here, the rearrangement. The order of the object changes. If you go too realistic, sometimes it's just so much more work that it's not worth it. It doesn't really pay off. It looks good enough, and that's it.
Serial as always.
And then there's this little magic he does, and the bowl bomb appears here. And there's the bowl front. There's the cereal front, and there's cereal's back. And then there's the milk and the bowl back. And I just animate that. So it looks a little bit like cereals fall into the bowl. The cereal and the milk are invisible, and I just resize the layer. So it pops in. It looks like it's popping in. Then the milk becomes visible, and I just move it upwards. So it still looks like it's filling up. And I just have those two layers of flakes that just fall in. And you do a little bit of squash and stretch here, to sell that, and that's that. And then Priscilla, there's one more thing going on, where she has this green thing, which is like Japanese seaweed. So this is the hand shape with a squiggly green thing, and then I switch her hand shape from this to just an empty hand. Yeah, seaweed. That's a seaweed. This is just layer animated, basically, to go into the bowl. Yeah, it goes in there and vanishes then, and then I have a bit of a spill, the spill here, which is actually not frame by frame, but it's basically just this vector shape that I'm just deforming with a few keyframes. It's just deforming. So it's just a part of the spill that flies over to Frank, as you can see here, that just lands on his face. And that's where this animation ends, and I later on just copy that vector into Frank's rig, and it's part of his head then. So then when he moves, then the spot stays in position. I even had to fix the head turn animation to make sure it stays where always in on the head, on the forehead. So that's boom, boom. So there's two tentacles, okay? The first one I made was just with a bunch of bones. If I just try to animate this is just as bad. So this is using the Arc IK solver somewhere on the tip. So the tip is the Arc IK solver. This used to be Moho's way of trying to make, if you have a chain of objects, to make them resolve in an arc. But the problem is it always tries to resolve in an arc, and it gets really flimsy and weird and never really works well. And so I kind of thought there's got to be a better way. And then I just remembered there was actually a demo of Victor Paredes showing the new, what they call this, curve, what is this thing called? Arc, warp, curve, warp, I forgot. You could just have a line that acts like a bone or like a deformer. So it's like you have a line that has several points, so it's like a vector, one-dimensional, and it has a strength like a bone. As you can see, this light blue thing here, and that just can deform your thingy. And what you can do on top of that, you can actually have a bone in there. You can bind that line, this arc thingy here, to the bone, so you can actually use the bone to animate stuff, which is much easier than having to look with Bezier and stuff, and everything gets deformed in a weird way. And it works much better. It's still not perfect. There's still a lot of weirdness going on. I also used a target bone, but I gave up. That didn't really work. So he has this thing on his forehead. It says, Priscilla, seriously? She's like, sorry, and you can see already here, you see the outline. The tentacle is lurking behind the mask. And then the bone pushes the tentacle up in the visible areas of the mask, and then a little bit of wiggling here. And next scene here, it gets really complicated, because here, as you can see now, I'm going to switch off the camera. I think it makes it easier to follow what's going on. So here, this is not in scene, so it doesn't matter if it's not aligned or anything. Here is where I switch the camera. You can see here the step at the bottom. So I'm just going to switch the camera, and that's it. And that's all I'm using for this scene, actually, because I did the whole action scene in here with this setup, and it just didn't work out. So that's why a lot of it is not aligned anymore. I just have abandoned this. I just cut here and said forget it. But just to show you what's going on here, so I have a separate Frank, which is just his head and one leg, and I think the arm in front of the tentacle, and that's it. It looks like it's wrapped around his neck. That's the whole trick. So this scene, yeah, I made this and I tried out a few things, and it just didn't really. I found that somehow this wasn't funny, because he seemed to be too much suffering in a way. You know, when he's pulled up like this, rather than in a comical, over-the-top way, it seems a bit too realistic in a way, that he's actually almost being hanged here, that just seemed, it's not funny, it's just a bit too much. That was funny, but here again, this struggle here didn't really work, so I didn't like that part. And then Humbug comes around and he pulls it out and pops it off. That was originally what I thought would be happening. And then he takes the ball and throws it out the window, but it all just didn't work out, because he lands way far away from the window now. Is he going to take this thing and run to the window? What's he going to do? So it didn't make sense. So I abandoned this part and remade it. And this is the latter half now of this scene.
Hold out! I'm coming!
She's taking notes. He's taking... So that worked for me, I think, was comical enough, and he's kind of cool going back to business, and she just isn't, it's like, yeah, everything back to normal. So another day at the office. What happens with Frank is kind of complex here because, so he starts off with his hands in front of the cereal. The cereal is important actually. You might have noticed that actually the cereal also moves in the action scene. And I thought it's kind of funny that it never drops or spills. It just jumps a bit around and moves around on the table, but it never spills. Originally, I planned to have it spilled, but that would be too much like what would normally happen, right? And I thought it's funnier to have something that is just very unlikely and stupid. Frank has his hands in front, or his hand and arm in front of the cereal. Rest of him is behind the table, basically, right? Let's go this frame by frame. His head has to be in front of the tentacle, so it can wrap around his neck. That's where it goes, around his neck. This is a bit of a failure here. I honestly, if I would be super precise about this, I'd want the tentacle to go on top of his shoulder. I just thought it's one frame. Come on, cut me some slack, because I would have to have another instance of Frank doing so. It's just too much, and so I thought, like, fuck it. So it goes around here, and I think this is around where I'm no, he pulls him over the table, and I decided to leave him behind the table until it's easy to put his belly on top of the table. So he's pulled over. So this is a bit weird here because he's behind the edge of the table. Doesn't make much sense, but it's really just one frame. So I thought, again, I can get away with this. In the next scene, you can see his belly is now finally on top of the table. So it looks like he's actually, he's on top of the table, but it's only the belly. So the belt and the lower abdomen is still behind the table. And he's kind of tipping, the ball is already kind of been shaken. So he's been smashed on the table, it pulls him up, and this is the moment when his front leg becomes visible, that is in front of the table. So we go here, he smashes him down here, and his belly, as you can see here, actually, if you look very closely, his belt is behind the table. It's actually a wrong rendering, but again, cut me some slack. It's just one frame. And then the leg is here. And the ball is being pushed a bit more towards the chair. One reason is, of course, I don't want the ball to be spilt. So the only thing it can do is move away from him, kind of, so it doesn't get knocked over, basically. So now we have one arm, one leg in front of the table, behind the front chair, and in front of the cereal. And again. And the ball is moving again. And for Humbug now, it's like, oh, I'm going away. But actually, supposedly he's just in a moment moving to the other side of the table. He's a gnome, he can do that. He can just go whoosh, whoosh, whoosh from one corner to the next in an instance. So don't tell me that continuity is wrong here. And here again, just going to show the whole frame here. So he comes up the chair, and this movement doesn't have to be that correct because he's outside of the frame, as you can see. You really see the tip of his leg, so I thought as long as that it looks fine, it's fine. So he goes up. So at this point, his back leg is behind the table, his back hand only is in front of the table. He climbs up, his front leg is in front of the table. And now I think next frame, I'm going to switch him all in front of the table. No, one more. Boom, he's in front of the table now. So walks over, does a jump. Tons of instances going on, partial instances that show only one part of the body. Absolute hell. And the worst thing about this whole stuff is, in the middle of the animation, of course, you very often notice, oh, I need another hand shape. You add one. And of course, if you add that hand shape to the original, all the instances will say like, oh, I'm out of sync, I don't have this hand shape, so you have to sync them again. And sometimes then suddenly movement goes out of sync and you have to say sync every layer with the original, and then all your hiding of layers is of course also synced, which means that all layers are visible as in the original, and you have to go back in and start animating all the hiding and showing of layers that you had. And so you have to redo this scene over and over. As soon as you change anything fundamental in the original rig, you say, oh, I'm going to rebind this point, I'm gonna relayer something. You just have to go back and maybe kill all the instances, create new instances, reanimate the visibility of the layers within you. It's hell. It's just something I think that doesn't really work well in Moho yet, and I'm not really happy that somehow instances tend to sometimes, for no reason whatsoever, go out of sync with the original, and then you have to tell it to go back into sync with the original, but that syncs everything. even included the stuff that you intentionally didn't want to sync, like mostly like layer visibility. And I think that's just a pain. There's got to be a better way of doing this. I used to have this technique when I do a body turn to hide and show layers and avoid layer animation. I can show you this actually. A good example would be Frank, I guess. When I show you the body turn here, you can see the arm goes behind the body, right? And now many people would do this just with a layer animation. But that's a really bad idea, because if you do that, your layer hierarchy will be locked. So if you animate and you at some point decide, oh, I have to change the order of layers, his back hand has to go in front of his face, although the arm is behind his body or something, then you're screwed, because you can't. It's all locked. It's locked in. So I have tried to figure out a way to simulate this, going in front and behind without using any animation. I put everything behind the torso. Then I make instances of all the limbs that I might want to go in front of the torso, and make these instances invisible. And if I need them showing in front, I just make them visible. And as you can see here, there is this arm upper B instance, which is invisible. And as soon as I go here, as you can see, it becomes visible when I make this movement. And I thought for a while, this is great, it's awesome. So this way I can have my nice layering simulated. If I do an animation, I want to change the actual layering of the thing. I can change it to anything I want, because there is nothing blocking the layer animation. But it turns out all too often these things go out of sync, or if you make an instance of this rig, it somehow doesn't create an instance of the instance, but it kind of creates an instance of the original. It's messy. It's just so all the instances that exist within your original rig are fine, but then if you make an instance of your original rig, then the instances of the instances in there actually refer back directly to the original rig, and things get really messy. So this is not a good solution either. So I'm at this point almost giving up and saying, oh, I'm just going to make a body turn without any layer animation and have to do it manually every single time I want to do a body turn. So it just moves, twitches the bones a bit, and then you have to go in manually and relayer everything. It's a pain, because you always want to have the flexibility for your hands and arms to go wherever they want. There are scenes where you want your hands in front of your face or under your chin for something, or you want to have your arms suddenly behind your body, both of them, or even if the shoulder is in front, you get caught by the cops, sure, and you have a side view, yes, your shoulder is in front, but your lower arm has to be behind the body. God knows what, you need the flexibility to move the layers individually within your rig. I'm giving up. I don't understand why Moho doesn't allow overriding. If you do a smart action with layer animation, it should allow you to just override that. And you can override bone angles and everything. Just layer animation is the one that it gets locked and you're screwed. So I'm not entirely happy with this jumping thing, doing this. This was also difficult because the tentacle, it's so difficult if you have two objects interact with each other. The tentacle itself has a bone, okay? And the main bone at the bottom here, that's the root, that's the thingy. A combination of layer animation and bone animation, and it gets really, really complicated because they screw up each other. So as you can see here, so the layer is being turned. If I say, oh, I want this to go a bit more down, what I have to do, I can't just pull this down, because if I pull this down, of course it pulls it's the root bone, yeah. I have to kind of, I can't move this either. I have to go reverse. Or, this has to be more flat. This has to be more flat. Now I move the bone down. This is the right shape. But what happens now is that the previous and the next frame now is screwed up. So I have to go back and fix everything again. And making this was absolute hell. And it's not perfect. It never is. But it mostly works. Next time I'll probably do 2 rigs. It will make my job much easier. So one rig that would be with the root bone at the bottom, and the other rig would be with the root bone at the top, and then you can just go and have it pulled from the tip of the tentacle. Things you learn. And then I'm moving back behind the table. He falls off the table. This also was complicated because I'm using target bones a lot for the hands, and I didn't really want to give up using target bones in this specific case. I can switch it off, bone targeting. There's hand target on off. If I just switch it off, you can see his hands would just be moved only by the actual bone angles. So if you have target bones and say, oh, he has to move with the arm up here, of course his limbs mostly stay in place. So if you start moving, you have to go in and say, oh, I've got to move this, and where are the leg points here, and his butt. And then you can finally move it, and then you can move him all together. But it gets really complicated if you then have to twist him, like he makes a twist in the air. Are you going to just move the layer? Isn't it going to screw up everything where he's located? You could also just say, I'm just going to twist the root bone, of course, but it only moves the upper body. Might be more natural, but again, there's so many adjustments in it you have to do. It is nightmarish. It is nightmarish, and was a lot of work. And here what I'm doing is basically just, so he's throwing the dude here. In the back wall, I have this back window switch layer. There's the broken and the fixed window, that's all. This is like alpha transparent, so I can put in a different background if I want to. The tentacle has two masks, basically. I'm just switching, basically. Mask none, mask window. Mask none means it's just huge. This is the mask none, so it's basically just a huge frame showing everything. So it's a mask that acts as if there is no mask. And the other one is the mask window, some of the shards, the broken parts of the window, plus the rest of the left side. So when it flies to the window, it seems to be appearing to vanishing through that hole. Yeah, here, mask none becomes invisible, as you can see here. It becomes invisible. And so now the only mask actually still active is mask window. And as long as the tentacle is in this area, it's visible, and you just put it out there, and that's it. Of course, I have to make sure that the twiddling of this flapping of the tentacle never goes outside of the mask area. So it cannot go here, up here, or it'll be cut off. So that's a bit finicky, just to make sure that it's just about in the right area. So it's gone.
Bills, bills, bills. They're gonna cut our electricity off.
Dad, you should have gotten solar panels.
With what money? In Hamburg. Get me some breakfast, stat.
Yes, more haste, less speed. Cereal as always. TV, deck thyself.
Priscilla, seriously?
Sorry,
Hold out! I'm coming!
Yeah, so this is how I animated a fairly complex scene in Moho. I'm kind of happy that I had to do this at the beginning. It's probably the most complex scene in the whole episode. So I'm happy to get this over with and have smooth sailing from now on to animate the rest of the episode.